The Occupy Wall Street movement started 2 years ago on September 17th with a protest in New York City. Occupy Wall Street used the Arab Spring and protests in Greece as their models for political action. The movement quickly became a nationwide phenomenon. Within weeks, Occupy movement sprung up in all 50 states and many cities. But after one summer, the Occupy movement quickly died out. By late autumn, a movement which once filled streets was reduced to a few people with protest signs. While occupiers seem to make a significant presence at certain events such as the NATO summit in Chicago, the consistent presence on the streets has seemed to slowly diminish. In December of 2012, documents were uncovered showing the government monitored Occupy movements. Federal officials had publicly labeled the movement as a peaceful one. Nathan Schneider was the first reporter to cover the initial planning meetings for the Occupy movement. He's also the editor of the website WagingNonviolence.org. A piece he wrote on the anniversary of the Occupy movement will be appearing in this next edition of the magazine The Nation. Schneider is our guest on the show today. He's here to talk to us about how the movement started, why it died down, and what lessons it teaches us for future mass political movements. Welcome to WHDT World News, Nathan.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
Okay, let's talk about the beginnings of the Occupy Wall Street movement. How did it start?
Well, the first call, the first kind of impulse, the first time we heard that name was in a email sent out and a tweet by Adbusters magazine, which is a kind of arts and activism magazine based in Canada. And it just said Occupy Wall Street with a picture of the Charging Bull statue, which is in the financial district in New York with a ballerina on top. And then it said at the top, "What is our one demand?" Well, that was about where Adbusters' work ended. And the next steps were picked up by a group of activists in New York City who were interested, inspired by this call, and who took it upon themselves to start planning and making it a reality. And so I started going to those meetings. And actually, at the time, this was in the summer of 2011, I was going to a few other different meetings, sets of meetings of different groups that were also planning occupations of public space in the United States.
Did they know? Did these groups know each other?
Air at that moment. All these groups doing this independently, and I wasn't sure which one might work or might not. But in the end, it seemed like it was the youth and the energy and the social media savvy of Occupy Wall Street that really captured people's imaginations.
Now, Nathan, you mentioned that you were going to several meetings. Did the organizers know that the other was planning the similar action?
In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. But it was really striking how independent they were and how little they were really talking to each other. And it was just, remember, this was after Tahrir Square. This was after the uprising in Madison. So there was kind of a precedent. And a lot of these folks had been looking around the world, watching the Spaniards and the Greeks. There were a lot of international people involved in these meetings. And so they were kind of just trying to bring the United States into what they perceived, into a global uprising they perceived around the world.
Now, at its peak, how big did the movement get?
Well, I think that's a bit hard to calculate. I think there were certainly tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who were directly involved with occupations around the country. Certainly, I'd say hundreds of thousands at least came through Zuccotti Park in New York City. But what was really striking was within a few weeks, this movement, according to polls, had the support of a majority of the United States. That's astonishing for a social movement to advance to that level of popularity and influence so quickly.
Now, what about when it started to taper off and die down? Why did that happen?
Well, I think taper off is not so much the term I would use. As far as the occupations were concerned and the physical presence, this movement was crushed. It was taken down by a coordinated effort of police departments and the Department of Homeland Security operating around the country, so that within the space of a week or two, this went from an active, thriving, though complicated and flawed occupation movement to physically almost nothing.
Would you say that any other significant movement has risen to take the place of the Occupy movement?
Well, what I would say is that the networks and the inspiration that took place there has not gone away. You know, in my new book, Thank You, Anarchy: Notes from the Occupy Apocalypse, you know, I use that word apocalypse, and people kind of raise their eyebrows at me. But what I mean by that is really the original etymology from the Greek, which is apocalypse means unveiling. And I think in a very real way, our society experienced an unveiling through this movement. It had to see itself in a new way. It had to understand more deeply the depth of economic inequality, of racial inequality, but then also the individuals who took part experienced an apocalypse. I've met so many people through this movement who came to have an experience from which they could never turn back. Their lives will never be the same. And so many of them, even if they aren't continuing to participate in things called Occupy, and some are, they're continuing to do work that is inspired and influenced and driven by that apocalypse that they experienced in Occupy. So now there are people working on issues, doing heightening and deepening campaigns against, for instance, the Keystone XL pipeline, against police brutality, against injustice in immigration, and against financial issues, the kinds of things that brought people in the first place often.
Now, Nathan, we're coming up on a break, and I don't mean to cut you off, but we do have to go to commercial. When we come back, I want to talk about the political changes that you see that came out of the Occupy movement and how it may be related or a relative of the Tea Party. So we got to jump to this break. We'll be right back. We're talking with Nation Schneider right here on WHDT World News.